Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History, episode 96, Vendée, The March to Hell. With a name like that, I'm sure you can guess what's coming next. From massacres and pillaging to the death of countless leaders, the final months of 1793 were brutal for both sides. This episode will see the end of the Grand Catholic and Royal Army and the triumph of the French Republic. But it will also see controversies, of which there are too many. The end of the Vendée is a tremendous tale, but I warn you, the violence is equally great. Of course, if you're enjoying the exploration of the infamous Civil War, you can support the show at patreon.com. Episode 94 was a bonus episode available exclusively for community members, and both this episode and the last have episode extras with fascinating bonus content. I could really use your help to keep the podcast in the fight, so please, if you'd like to do your part to make history that isn't black and white, support the show today at patreon.com. Now, it's with great pleasure that I get to welcome the newest community members. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Andy, David, and Atari, and another warm welcome to the new true revolutionary Sean. Additionally, a special thank you to Jersey for increasing his pledge and becoming a champion of the people. Finally, one last thank you to all community members and a shout out to the Pantheon of Heroes, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. And with that, let's get into it. In the early summer of 1793, the Vendéans seemed unstoppable. Saumur and Angers had fallen. The Republicans were in flight. As the rebels marched on both banks of the Loire, the white flag of royalism appeared destined for the Cathedral of Nantes. Abandoned by the Convention and crippled by division, surely the great western port would fall. But history is no stranger to the improbable, and when a well-placed bullet hit Generalissimo Catlino, the royalist assault was slain. Catlino himself would follow weeks later, and by mid-July, the Saint of Anjou lay dead. For the various rebel armies of the now infamous Vendée, Nantes was meant to be everything: foreign aid, a pacified rear, a launchpad to Paris and glory. Instead, the city had delivered misery. The army of God would soon discover hell. In the immediate aftermath of the defeat of Nantes, the Catholic and Royal Army disintegrated. Charette and his army of the Marche promptly returned to their home territory, while the Grande Armée was left to rival officers. As the rebel armies separated and squabbled, an opportunity arose for the Republic. Their foe had been proven mortal. Now was the time to strike. Yet, while July and August are crucial for understanding the atrocities of the Vendée, the summer months saw no conclusive outcome. Distracted by foreign armies and federalist revolts, the Convention's attention remained elsewhere. The result was insufficient resources and inconclusive fighting. As both sides saw setbacks and success, these unremarkable engagements obscured monumental change. For the revolutionaries in particular, developments were underway which fundamentally altered the course and nature of the conflict. Before we can witness the horrific defeat of the Vendéans, we must unpack three critical shifts. The The first of these occurs in Paris and relates to the government's increasing extremism. Frustrated by the lack of success in Western France, the Committee of Public Safety embraced total war. Having taken a hard line against the Federalist revolts, the committee was willing to go even further against royalist traitors. The face of the government's hardening approach was naturally Bertrand Barrère. Often considered the mouthpiece of the Committee of Public Safety, Barrère delivered a key speech to the convention on the 1st of August. To set the scene, the influential deputy continued to frame the Vendée as the epitome of counter-revolution. The linchpin of a vast international conspiracy, Barrère made it clear that only through violence could royalty be uprooted and the Vendée finally suppressed. Consequently, if the nation was to live in happiness, and if the people were to enjoy their rights, the Republic needed to eliminate all resistance through any means necessary. Translated into actual policy, Barrère proposed the extermination of the Vendée. We will have peace the day the interior is peaceful, the rebels are subdued, and the brigands are exterminated. The conquests or perfidies of foreign powers will be null and void the day the Department of Vendée has lost its infamous name and its parricidal and guilty population. No more Vendée, no more royalty, no more Vendée, no more aristocracy, no more Vendée, and the enemies of the Republic have disappeared. With Parisian politics having moulded the Vendée into the greatest of all monsters, Barrère's cries for extermination were met with thunderous applause. For months, the Vendée had been portrayed as the ultimate threat, the home of fanatics, the den of brigands, the central citadel of conspiracy and plots. With every response seeing setbacks and defeats, the convention was ready to embrace Barrère's excess. As the deputy proposed plans to exterminate counter-revolution, his peers eagerly agreed. Here, the Committee of Public Safety, by your authorization, has prepared measures which tend to exterminate this rebellious race, to make their layers disappear, to burn their forests, to cut their crops, and to fight them as much by workers and pioneers as by soldiers. It is in gangrenous wounds that medicine brings iron and fire. It is in the Vendée that political medicine must employ the same means and the same remedies. So, on the 1st of August, 1793, the National Convention adopted a policy of extermination. As you can imagine, this has tremendous consequences and will feature prominently next episode as we unpack the massacres of the war. But for now, our takeaway is simple. The convention had embraced extreme violence, and its representatives would follow suit. Whether military officers, ministerial agents, or deputies assigned to the departments, extermination was the order of the day. The eagerness to enact this agenda can be seen just 2 weeks later by one representative on mission. We will execute the decrees of the Vendée. We will burn down all the hiding places of the brigands. We will send the women, the children, and the old men to the rear of the army, and we will shoot all the others. We will never be done with them otherwise. All these villains are fanatics. Yet, despite these fighting words from a representative on mission, issuing threats is always easy. Following through is the hard part. For that, the convention needed both fury and firepower. The former came in the elevation of ultra-radical commanders, the second key development which would shape the horrors of the Vendée. Up until August, many of the Republic's officers had once been aristocrats. Veterans of the old royal army, their noble heritage was suspicious enough, let alone their constant setbacks. As the summer progressed in 1793, the Albertists and the enraged were competing to lead the capital's ultra-radicals after the death of Marat. Ultimately, the Albertists won, and a key priority for the militant sans-culottes was the purging of the army's officer corps. By now, Albertist sympathisers already staffed much of the war ministry, and so, in the face of continued failings in the Vendée, much of the local leadership was removed. Unlucky commanders were replaced by firm patriots, and this had three noteworthy consequences. Firstly, the Albertist commanders were willing to take off the gloves. They weren't bluffing when they said that they would exterminate the rebellion, and they took the convention's rhetoric at face value. Consequently, the level of violence escalated. Executions and the destruction of property became more common, and non-combatants increasingly suffered as a result. In turn, the Vendéans embraced harsher reprisals of their own, feeding a cycle of escalation. Caught up in an atmosphere of paranoia and extremism, we find some rather far-fetched ideas on how to enact this extermination. Radical officers discussed the viability of a whole host of plots, including mines with poison gas or the deliberate transfer of poisoned brandy. Historian Renaud Séché even claims that supposedly poisoned air was tested on sheep, but thankfully for Dolly, these experiments came to naught. Of course, flames and blades were no less devastating, and so blood continued to flow. Now, I should note that there is disagreement regarding the extent of the escalating violence at this stage of the campaign. Some representatives on mission gave formal orders trying to limit pillaging and burning of suspected rebel villages. Likewise, clarifications were given trying to shelter the property of good Republicans. Of course, in the heat of battle, regulations can be flexible, and the extent that they were enforced by Albertist officers on undisciplined raw recruits is very much questionable. That said, it is clear that the violence was worsening, and for a variety of reasons. Critically, not only were the ultra-radicals genuine believers in the merits of total war, but they needed the resulting destruction as evidence of success. As historian David Bell notes, military triumphs remained elusive for the Albertists, and so the new generals had no way of demonstrating their progress other than a high body count. Likewise, more moderate officers were encouraged to embrace similar tactics, as to do otherwise would encourage denunciation. But in addition to the increasing frequency and severity of violence, the elevation of Albertist officers had another key consequence: military blunders. As discussed in previous episodes, the Republic's war ministry had a tendency to prioritize politics over competency. Supported by the ultra-radicals, the war minister was unapologetic in his belief that patriotism and republicanism were the most important talents. Eventually, Lazare Carnot would reshape the officer corps based on meritocracy, but at the start of August 1793, Carnot was not yet even on the Committee of Public Safety. So, when I say the summer saw the elevation of Albertist officers, I don't mean experienced military veterans who happened to share ultra-radical opinions. No, I mean reliable sans-culottes who have never seen a battle in their life. Like the painter-turned-General Carteau, who took command at Toulon, many prominent Albertist officers in the Vendée were hopelessly inexperienced. That said, you could be forgiven for thinking that they were as talented as Napoleon, given their rapid promotions to lofty commands. Take, for example, Charles-Philippe Ronsard. Once a corporal in the old Royal Army, Ronsard had departed the armed forces prior to the American Revolutionary War. Having never seen action, his civilian life was just as unremarkable. A failed playwright, the Revolution offered opportunities, and boy, did he seize them. Becoming active in the Cordelier Club in Paris, Ronsard befriended many of the city's most radical revolutionaries. This included those associated with the Albertists, and it was due to these ties that the War Ministry decided to employ him. In May 1793, Ronsard was sent to the Vendée as an agent of the War Minister. A fierce partisan, this creature of the clubs wasted no time in fighting the royalist rebels. Let's try that again. This creature of the clubs wasted no time in fighting fellow Republicans. Denouncing multiple generals for treason and conspiracy, Ronsard's biased testimony condemned several innocent commanders. Elevating like-minded peers to replace these unfortunate souls, Ronsard was transferred into the army itself in June. Here, we see one of the most rapid promotions in all of human history. Initially enlisting as a captain on 30 June, Ronsard was promoted to major, lieutenant colonel, and then brigadier general over the next 4 days. That's right, from captain to brigadier general in just 4 days, all without seeing combat. Unsurprisingly, while the radicalism of men like Ronsard increased the conflict's violence, success was less forthcoming. Although supporters considered Ronsard intelligent, courageous, and vigorous, most detractors see an ambitious and mediocre adventurer wildly out of his depth. Certainly, those he promoted, such as actors who also had no military experience, were poor choices for command. Naturally, this incompetent leadership protracted the war, ironically worsening the fatalities of both the sans-culotte soldiers they championed and the veteran officers who were supplied as scapegoats. But the rise of Albertist officers did have a final noteworthy consequence. In addition to inadequate leadership in the field, the elevation of so many inexperienced ideologues created further dysfunction within military headquarters. Career officers who had actually fought in wars were dismayed by the tactics of men who had never seen combat. Moreover, when these radicals were subordinates rather than commanders, experienced veterans were all too aware that a single denunciation could see them on the scaffold. Nonetheless, failing to adequately win engagements was becoming equally deadly, and so officers couldn't just blindly follow the preferred strategy of the Albertists. The result was a nest of vipers. Accusations, recriminations, private and public attacks. The Republic's military commanders were engaged in their own war of words. Add into the mix the representatives on mission who had their own agendas, not to mention local politicians and clubs, and the result was complete disorder. Indeed, in the recent bonus episode on the Vendée, we heard one contemporary describe the scene as anarchy. But part of the issue here was not just politics and personalities, but fundamental disagreements on how the armed forces should operate. As discussed in our deep dives on total war, ultra-radicals were inclined to embrace the untested ideas which championed citizen soldiers. What good was discipline or rifles when brave sans-culottes were allegedly unbeatable? What good were formal tactics when a national uprising was combined with the fabled French Elan? Of course, these grand ideas were soon shredded by Vendéan bullets, prompting cries of betrayal from the radicals and demands for more heads. Watching this, veteran officers could only shake their heads, at least while they were still attached to their body. Pleading with anyone who would listen, military men insisted that new approaches were necessary. Reversals would only continue without discipline, supplies, and capable leadership. General Kleber, already a respected officer who was later assassinated in Cairo during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, was dismayed by the scene. Referring to one council of war, Kleber wrote simply that he had never seen a collection of men less fitted to lead troops. Historian David Bell summarizes the inexperience of the radical commanders, their impact on the conflict, and the resulting dysfunction amongst Republican forces. Lauzun's fall formed part of a campaign in which Ronsard and his allies, during the summer and fall of 1793, fought to take control of the war effort in the Vendée. In September, they managed to replace Conclus, the defender of Nantes, with a sans-culotte non-entity named Jean Lechelle, who soon received a new, unified command over all Republican forces. Lechelle in turn gave way to an unstable former goldsmith, who encouraged soldiers to disobey the orders of insufficiently radical officers. Ronsard also made generals of two actor cronies who had seen only stage battlefields, not real ones. But, for the Hébertists, as we have already seen, political orthodoxy had an absolute primacy over military experience. When appointing Thurot supreme commander in November, the war minister instructed him to dismiss any officer who was not recognized as Republican or totally devoted to the popular system. Professional soldiers such as Conclus and Kleber could not conceal their disgust for the Hébertists. After one particularly humiliating defeat, Lechelle openly exclaimed, "What did I do to deserve to command such cowards?" One of Kleber's wounded men replied, "What did we do to deserve being commanded by such a fucking bastard?" So, the arrival and elevation of so many Hébertist officers was consequential to the Republic's war effort, from embracing the convention's exterminationist rhetoric to encouraging both blunders and dysfunction. The impact of men like Ronsard was critical to the campaign. Yet, I said there were three key developments over the summer of 1793, and the third has to do with firepower. Up until August, the Vendée had generally been ignored. Sure, rhetorically, it was the greatest threat to the Republic, but in actuality, the convention had other priorities. Given the Austrian, Prussian, Spanish, and English invasions, not to mention the Federalist revolts, this distraction was understandable. But as 1793 progressed, those fronts offered the Republic a tremendous opportunity. Firstly, you may recall that as the coalition slowly seized fortresses along the northern frontiers, French garrisons were generally paroled on certain conditions. In the case of the defenders of mines, the Prussians released almost 20,000 prisoners, provided they did not fight the Allied powers for a year. The convention took this deal and decided to indulge in some clever interpretation. Sure, the army of mines would not fight the coalition, but the Vendéans were simply rebels. Legally, there was nothing stopping the Republic from deploying these experienced veterans to the west. Combined with the fact that the Federalist revolts were increasingly subdued, the convention now had a perfect opportunity to send hardened soldiers to the Vendée. This was a game-changer. Although they were at times commanded by inexperienced Hébertists, the army of mines made a huge difference. So far, the Republic had been trying to quell the rebellion with volunteers and raw recruits. Now they had professionals. Joined by capable officers like the aforementioned Kleber, these hardened warriors were ready to unleash hell. Thus, as autumn arrived in 1793, the Republic's response had undergone fundamental changes. Firstly, the convention had embarked on total war. including an explicit policy of extermination in the Vendée. Secondly, ultra-radicals largely led the Western war effort, although veteran officers could still be found. Finally, that struggle would now be waged, at least in part, by actual soldiers. Swapping Prussians for peasants, the army of mines was ready. Yet, the French Revolution is never, ever simple. And if you think this is the part where the Republic finally starts winning, well, it's more complicated than that. Since their defeat at Nantes in late June, the following months had seen mixed results for the Vendéans. Recent failures encouraged desertion, while rival commanders splintered the cohesion that existed before Nantes. Now overstretched, the royalists were forced to abandon major gains from June, including Angers and Saumur on the Loire River. But, despite no singular strategy and the difficulty of maintaining their peasant forces, the rebels had been doing all right. Sure, they had suffered defeats, but they had also scored notable successes. In fact, victories had remained forthcoming, not only against the Republic's raw recruits, but also the army of mines. The reasons for these continued setbacks are obscured by Republican dysfunction. To set the scene, the convention actually had two different armies stationed in the west. Firstly, there was the army of the coasts of Brest, largely operating from Nantes. And secondly, there was the army of the coasts of La Rochelle, which was generally commanded further east towards Saumur. Even in normal times, two separate armies would naturally compete, be it for glory and honour or just limited resources. The opposing interests of two independent forces is historically a recipe for trouble. But these were not normal times. Not only were shortages of men and supplies acute, but ambition, politics, ideology, and prosecutions further encouraged dysfunction. Moreover, while both forces were Republican, they actually represented very different versions of the Republic. To the north, the army of Brest up in Nantes was still commanded by General Conclou. A key player in saving the city in late June, Conclou was a former aristocrat. Likewise, so too were many of his subordinates, while others were veterans of the old Royal Army, known for their moderate politics. Stationed alongside Conclou were representatives on mission. Yes, they were Jacobin, but these particular deputies were, and I cannot stress this enough, deeply hostile to the Hébertists. Thus, the army of Brest, led by the so-called Party of Nantes, in some ways represented a more moderate revolution. Aristocratic commanders emphasized traditional discipline and professionalism, while their civilian overseers were equally belligerent towards ultra-radical ideology. However, over to the east, the army of La Rochelle, led by the so-called Party of Saumur, was the exact opposite. There, many noble officers had been denounced and arrested, and Hébertists reigned supreme. Combined with zealous representatives on mission, this group embodied a more radical vision of both the army and the revolution. Critically, the fact that these competing armies represented different ideals supercharged the campaign's dysfunction. Moreover, the stakes were incredibly high. As discussed in the recent bonus episode, just as Parisian politics created the Vendée would in turn create Parisian politics. Such were the political rewards of slaying the nation's most dangerous foe. Back in the capital, the Hébertists were debatably at the height of their power in September 1793. The insurrection of 4 and 5 September commenced weeks of radical reforms, including the law of suspects and the introduction of price controls. Furthermore, the trials of Marie Antoinette and the Girondins occurred at their insistence the following month. Consequently, If the army of La Rochelle was victorious in the west, the political spoils for Hebert and his allies would have been immense. Vindicated in their approach, perhaps it would have been enough to seize the reins of government. Remember, only with great difficulty was the convention keeping the radicals at bay. But if the army of Brest proved the merits of a more moderate approach, those same ultra-radicals might be vanquished. If aristocratic veterans defeated the great royalist menace, how could the Hebertists sustain their calls for even greater extremism? For example, purging all former nobles and replacing all officers with ultra-radicals would be entirely unthinkable. Moreover, an emboldened moderate army could then be used to suppress the militant movement in Paris, which had regularly used force to impose its demands on the convention. Thus, it was in this high-stakes situation that the army of Mainz arrived. Ironically, this only made things worse. With hardened professionals seen as the key to victory, both camps fought bitterly to ensure that they were given command. Not only were generals involved in this war of words, but perhaps even more so were some representatives on mission. Motives differed for each individual, but the ambitious knew full well the spoils for being the deputy which oversaw final victory. Obviously, the army of Mainz could not be in two places simultaneously, and the Committee of Public Safety was dismayed by the endless squabbling of Republican forces. Ultimately, the parties of Nantes and Saumur were forced to agree on one approach, and General Conclus won the day. But this is where things get murky, and accusations obscure the campaign. Granted the veterans of Mainz, Conclus devised his winning strategy, effectively proposing the creation of a large noose around the conflict zone. The army of Brest would sweep down from Nantes and claim the western coastline of the Vendée. Critically, this would prevent aid from the English and would compel the rebels to withdraw to the east. Simultaneously, the army of La Rochelle would launch attacks on the southern and eastern extremities of the Vendée. This would force local insurgents to the west. Essentially, the royalists would be obliged to congregate in the centre of the region, while Republican troops slowly closed the noose. Compelled to give battle, the Blues would finally crush the Whites. However, despite being devised by a capable commander, Conclus' strategy had problems. At points, the conflict zone was more than 100 miles wide, or 160 kilometres. With Republican forces approaching from multiple directions, coordination was essential. But, despite a pre-agreed timetable, reality rendered this schedule meaningless. Setbacks and confusions resulted in disorganised columns, and isolated units were easy pickings for the Vendéans. Ultimately, some Republican forces were brutally mauled, with the Royalists making the most of their home turf advantage. Thus, despite the success of the initial campaign, even the army of Mainz was handed a bloody defeat. Naturally, accusations and denunciations soon engulfed Republican headquarters. Shockingly, one representative on mission, Filippo, even accused Hebertist commanders of sabotaging the operations in an effort to gain political advantage. Conclus' noose had in part collapsed thanks to reversals in the south and east, the fronts allocated to the army of La Rochelle. Given these issues, including premature orders to retreat, Filippo dared to denounce deliberate obstruction. Counterclaims were made, and these charges ultimately played out publicly in the Parisian Jacobin Club. The society was forced to adjudicate between its own squabbling members, and Robespierre had to intervene to calm tensions. Now, some historians do agree that ultra-radicals were sabotaging Conclus and the so-called Party of Nantes. However, many of the latter's accusations stem from this one Jacobin deputy named Filippo, and he is not the most trustworthy. A passionate critic of the Albertists, Filippo will feature in the future in the civil wars of the Jacobin Club. Moreover, I would note that in the personal correspondence of some individuals, there was admission of errors and mistakes in both the Army of Brest and the Army of La Rochelle. That said, in an era where setbacks were considered crimes, people needed to protect their heads. The result was blaming others in an attempt to avoid the scaffold. Consequently, it is difficult for us to identify the difference between coincidence, incompetence, bad luck, and outright sabotage. With the campaign of mid-September delivering yet another fiasco, the Committee of Public Safety forcefully intervened. Dismissing much of the aristocratic leadership of the Army of Brest, the committee also reorganised its forces in the Western Theatre. Henceforth, most of the Army of Brest would join the Army of La Rochelle, along with troops from the Army of Mines. This new army was titled the Army of the West, making things much easier for you and me. Reflecting the power of the Albertists in both the War Ministry and Paris, its new commander was another ultra-radical. A soldier in a former life, Le Chelle was a fencing master before re-enlisting for the Revolution. While he was certainly a sans-culotte general, he was not the Republic's best tactician. Largely viewed as incompetent, he'll be in command for only a matter of weeks. But for those wondering why the committee was elevating yet another ultra-radical, despite their obvious shortcomings, the answer is pretty simple: politics. As autumn arrived in 1793, the Albertists were at the height of their power. Historian Jean Jaurès notes that Le Chelle was recommended by the ultras, and to reject him would see the convention break with the most radical sans-culottes. With the capital's militants at their zenith, rupture was a serious risk. Weeks prior, crowds had overwhelmed the convention on the 4th and 5th of September, and another day of action was entirely possible. In fact, so too was another revolution. As such, appeasement was the best policy. If the Albertists wanted Le Chelle, then Le Chelle it would be. But despite the incompetent Le Chelle taking command of a unified Army of the West, the Republic soon scored a major victory. Ironically, this was not due to Le Chelle's genius, but rather a willingness to follow advice. For a short time, General Conclus counselled his sans-culotte successor. Replacing his original new strategy of September, Conclus now proposed a more simple two-pronged assault. Marching into the centre of the Vendée from both the north and the south, the Blues again hoped to force a final battle by striking at the rebellion's heart. The resulting October campaign commenced with renewed success. Armed with professional soldiers and endless recruits thanks to mass conscription, the Republic steadily advanced. True, the Whites fought heroically, and at times the Blues were rebuffed. But progress was consistent. In the second week of October, the rebels lost their makeshift capital of Châtillon. Although temporarily reclaimed, the Dantonist general Westermann ensured it was burnt to a crisp. The target of factional denunciations, Westermann was keen to prove a point after his recent acquittal. Like many, he hoped to demonstrate his Republican credentials with the currency of rebel blood. Facing setbacks in the north and south, the Whites amassed in the centre of the Vendée. For the retreating royalists, the situation was now absolutely dire. Demoralised and despondent, their complete annihilation was a real and present threat. Internal squabbles only made things worse, and disunity proved deadly. Critically, Charette and the so-called Army of the Marsh remained to the west. Refusing to come to the aid of their fellow insurgents, the Grande Armée was alone. Charette had no shortage of quarrels with the latter's leading figures, but even amongst its own officers, discord was rife. As the Catholic and Royal Army prepared for battle, its leaders were at odds over strategy. For months, the influential Beauchamp had pressed for an expedition to Brittany. The ancient province was smouldering with discontent, and its successful rising could prove game-changing for the faltering insurrection. But crossing the Loire northwards would essentially surrender the Vendée to the Republic, forcing other prominent officers to doom their homeland. This they would not do, and so it was agreed to make a last stand south of the Loire. The main event occurred on the 17th of October, 1793. Days earlier, the Republic had occupied the notable town of Cholet, and the Royalists were intent on its reclamation. The Republicans were technically led by Le Chelle, but in reality, command fell to his subordinate, the capable officer Kleber. Leading a force of perhaps 25,000, including a sizable contingent of veterans, the experienced general faced a foe of some 40,000 rebels. But as the insurgents advanced upon Cholet, the whites were ghosts of their former selves. 4 months prior, the rebels had seemed unstoppable. Town after town had fallen to their cries. The Saint of Anjou led an army obviously blessed by God. Now, after months of steady reversals, they were shells of their former selves. As one Vendéan remarked, they marched with calm and resignation, like Christians to martyrdom. But while the mood was bleak within the rebel camp, the whites had every intention to die fighting. The ensuing battle was hard fought and tiresome, and momentarily the Royalists appeared triumphant. Exploiting gaps left by the Republic's frightened recruits, the rebels made it inside Cholet itself. The town's defences were crumbling. Victory was near. Yet Kleber knew what he was doing, and so too did his veterans of the Rhineland. Perfectly executing a devastating manoeuvre, Kleber's reserves outflanked the enemy. Attacked from behind, the rebels panicked. A rout was soon to follow. Importantly, in a repeat of the Battle of Nantes, 2 of the most prominent Vendéans were wounded, including their current generalissimo, Delby. Literally dragging their leaders back in a disorganized retreat, the scene was one of carnage and disorder. By the time the battle ended, perhaps 5,000 rebels were killed or wounded. Another 400 were burnt alive in a nearby hospital, which was captured by the Blues. With the victory of Cholet in mid-October, the Vendée could have been silenced. As discussed in recent episodes, the Loire River acted as a sort of natural barrier for the conflict. With the rebels having surrendered key bridges in towns like Saumur, the Republic believed its prey was cornered, at least for a while. The result was a race against time. Bloodied and exhausted, everything depended on crossing the Loire. If the Republic could trap the Royalists on its banks, the entire revolt would be crushed. Unfortunately for the Blues, this was not to be. Like the Austrians just a day prior, after the Battle of Wattignies, the enemy would unexpectedly cross the river with astonishing speed. To do this, a detachment of rebels had gone north before the Battle of Cholet. Securing a small town and boats to ferry their army, the Whites had a route of escape. Now, such an escape might not have been necessary had those 4,000 troops actually been fighting at the Battle of Cholet. But, with the Royalist leadership divided, historians differ if this action was pre-agreed or if prominent Vendéan commanders were undertaking independent manoeuvres. Moreover, it appears that some officers wished to remain south of the Loire. However, the common soldiers demanded a crossing, refusing to re-engage the Blues. Whatever the case, some Republican officers later complained that their commander, Le Châtelet, had failed to adequately defend the river. Fortified positions and a few gunboats may well have sunk the rebellion then and there. But to digress momentarily, as retreating royalists frantically crossed the Loire River, the rebels had a sizable problem. Holding some 5,000 Republican prisoners of war, the regular troops demanded mass executions. After all, to ferry them over the Loire was impractical, while their release would merely strengthen the enemy. Combined with the fact that the Blues were currently executing hundreds of wounded Vendéans who had failed to escape Cholet, the Whites had justification for gruesome eliminations. But while he lay dying, the influential leader Beauchamp insisted upon their release. Wounded at Cholet hours before, Beauchamp embraced his Christian faith as he demanded mercy for the imprisoned. As such, thousands were released, a fact that astonished pretty much everyone. Upon investigation, one representative on mission wrote to the Committee of Public Safety, reporting the situation and suggesting they suppress the news. I arrive with Bourseau and some troops, but I arrive too late to drown the remains of the brigands. This army of the Pope, which has done so much harm and which has not been pursued with sufficient revolutionary activity, still eludes us. But it no longer has any leaders. Lescure is dying, Delby is mortally wounded, Beauchamp has only a few hours to live. These cowardly enemies of the nation have, according to what is said here, spared more than 4,000 of our people, whom they were holding prisoner. The fact is true, for I heard it from the very mouths of several of them. Some were moved by this stroke of incredible hypocrisy. I lectured them, and they soon understood that they owed no gratitude to the brigands. But, as the nation is not yet to our patriotic feelings, you will act wisely by not breathing a word about such an indignity. Free men accepting life at the hands of slaves, this is not revolutionary. This unfortunate action must therefore be buried in oblivion. Do not even mention it to the convention. The brigands do not have time to write or publish newspapers. This will be forgotten like so many other things. We will now march against them and deploy all the forces of the Republic. But I will long regret not having been able to make them take an immense bath in the Loire. The river is so wide. In the wake of the Battle of Cholet, the Republicans would indeed regret their missed opportunity. With the royalist host escaping north of the Loire, its elimination was delayed by almost 2 months. Critically, the Whites were no longer just a military force, but a mixture of soldiers and non-combatants. Joining some 30 to 40,000 fighters was at least 15 to 20,000 refugees. In fact, that's the lower end of the estimates, and some place the figure at substantially more, perhaps as much as 60,000. Fearful of Republican reprisals, many civilians had chosen to cross the Loire as well. Consequently, women, children, and the elderly marched with priests, nuns, and former nobles. Such an exodus is not unusual in history, yet neither are the associated problems. Hunger, exhaustion, and disease soon became an ever-present enemy, and the company of so many civilians placed great strain on the rebellion. However, in the first weeks of this great northern march, the rebels were no strangers to success. In fact, initial encounters were terrible for the Republic, despite their great victory at Cholet. always eager for a fight, the Dantonist General Westermann's decisions and recommendations resulted in multiple setbacks. Together with the mistakes of the Hébertist-backed General Lechelle, the result was an absolute bloodbath. Historian Georges Lefebvre describes these defeats as decisive, while Renaud Sachet states that the Vendéans crushed the veterans of mines. In a matter of days, the Blues had lost 5,000 men. So appalling was the situation that Lechelle was stripped of command by representatives on mission. Others, including Lechelle himself, denounced the treachery of those veterans who once fought for the king. Certainly, the army was restless, and we heard earlier a quote from one soldier who questioned why they were led by such bastards. Put simply, many professional soldiers resented their Hébertist commanders and desired the recall of competent officers, even if they were once aristocrats. Ultimately, for these defeats in late October, it was Lechelle who paid the price. Imprisoned for his failings, he potentially claimed his own life. Whatever the precise cause, the sans-culotte general was found dead in the second week of November. Replacing Lechelle was another man of the people, a former goldsmith actively involved in both the storming of the Bastille and the overthrow of the monarchy. Championed by political allies, Rossignol is one of the better regarded Hébertist generals, if for no other reason that he seems to be more self-aware of his own limitations. But as the Blues experienced yet more turnover at the top, they weren't the only side forced to renew their leadership. The defeats of October had proved deadly for royalist leaders, and the Vendéans required a new chief. The thankless task fell to Henri de la Rocheclaux. Brave, daring, and idolized by sympathizers throughout history, La Rocheclaux was aged just 21 when he took command. A former noble and army officer, La Rocheclaux was an audacious man of battle, the perfect choice for the hard fights ahead. Yet, taking command after successive defeats, La Rocheclaux faced nothing but bad news. Crossing the Loire was only ever supported by a handful of senior officers, and now the Whites required a strategy. As usual, the Royalists were bitterly divided, and the options discussed were divergent to say the least. Brittany, Normandy, even Paris, these were just some of the proposals. In the end, as the insurgents argued over each and every option, the decision was made for them by foreign intervention. Although distracted by a laundry list of war aims, the British had finally decided that this Western rebellion was of interest. Although not the first time England had sent agents to the Vendée, a somewhat solid proposal reached the rebels as they wandered north of the Loire. Put simply, the British promised aid and support if the insurgents could reach Granville, a town in western Normandy. This channel port would have enabled cooperation with both the British and French émigrés. Lying just north of the famous tidal island of Mont Saint-Michel, Granville was also close to the Channel Island of Jersey. Incidentally, some Vendéan rebels would make it to Mont Saint-Michel and free priests who were currently prisoners. But it was in an effort to avoid becoming prisoners themselves that the Royalists decided to march north. Burdened by tens of thousands of civilians, the situation was increasingly desperate as disease, desertion, hunger, and bloodshed all claimed their price. Unfortunately for the local inhabitants, these hardships were spread by the Royalists. Unable to feed such a host of at least 60,000, the rebels devoured the countryside. It's perhaps not surprising that such actions did not win hearts and minds. While perhaps as many as 12,000 Breton rebels, known as the Chouans, did bolster the insurgency, the local population generally rejected calls to fight for God and King. The end result was a bleak migration further north. French historian Louis Blanc paints a terrible scene. Lamentable and tragic was this march of the Vendée peasants, whom every step took further from the tombs of their fathers and their beloved villages. A portion of the armed people, dragging a few cannons behind them, formed the vanguard. Then came, without any order and filling the entire path, the baggage, the priests, the wounded, the women carrying their children, a tumultuous jumble of men, half pilgrims, half soldiers. The confusion was immense, irreparable. At odds with the misery of the royalist host, the revolutionaries were on the rise. By now, Toulon was all that remained of the Federalist revolts, and the Republic had steadied much of its Belgian frontier. Furthermore, Spain and Piedmont Sardinia had been checked on their respective fronts, freeing up yet more men and supplies. In such circumstances, recruits poured into camp. Sure, they were untrained and ill-equipped, but at a time when the royalists were steadily losing strength, the Blues were gaining it by the day. That said, internal dysfunction remained, as did the logistical challenges of fighting over such a vast territory. Lacking both cohesion and coordination, the conflict's end proved elusive. By mid-November, the Whites reached the port of Granville. Unfortunately for them, the Union Jack was missing from the sea. Demoralised and desperate, the rebels attempted a siege anyway. But the defenders stood firm. Without the support of the British Navy, Granville proved impregnable. Highlighting the deteriorating situation for the insurgents, the assault had been hampered by troops getting drunk and disorderly. Divisions were also high amongst royalist officers, and it appears that some may have even attempted to desert. Yet, having marched for weeks in miserable conditions, the soldiers of the Grande Armée snapped. Some 100 miles north of their beloved homeland, the demands of the troops were simple: return to the Vendée. La Rochefoucauld and others would have liked to have done otherwise. Perhaps another Norman port could be captured, or the British contacted for aid. Unbeknownst to them, support was nearby, delayed by poor weather and incomplete intelligence on the rebels' location. Nonetheless, there are times when men lead their officers, and La Rochefoucauld was forced to oblige. Turning around after a month on the move, the rebels were heading home. Or so they hoped. Theoretically, the Republic once again had an opportunity to crush the Vendéan menace. But, to quote one contemporary, it was the Blues who were killed like flies. Advancing in separate columns in an attempt to trap the rebels against the coast, the usual dysfunction hindered the Republic's response. Of course, communication was a genuine challenge, but what's less justifiable is the issues caused by rivalries and incompetent Bertist officers. The result was multiple royalist victories in short succession, as mistakes and miscalculations allowed the massive rebel host to dispatch isolated Republican contingents. That said, while the Whites' success was undeniable, it was also final. These were the last great victories of the Catholic and Royal Army. Having broken free of a potential trap, the Royalists could march home to the Vendée. The problem, however, was not getting to the Loire, but rather crossing over it. No longer in possession of either boats or bridges, it was decided to retake Angers. The city had willingly surrendered in mid-June, and hopes for a quick victory weren't unreasonable. With a bridge over the impassable river, Angers was the ticket home. But much had changed since the preceding months, and this time government forces were determined to resist. So too were local residents. Historian Louis Blanc depicts the struggle which followed. Republican generals had entered Angers 2 days before the siege, and although 3,000 armed men was insufficient for a defence, The ardour of the inhabitants was so great that the Vendeans came to break against this barrier. Masters of the suburbs, they had to withstand, throughout the day of December 3, the fire of 20 pieces of artillery. Beaupuy, barely recovered from his wound, was the soul of the defence. He was admirably seconded. Old men, young girls, women, children ran at will to carry food and ammunition to the ramparts. Among the Vendeans, on the contrary, all was discouragement. To persuade them to a general assault, the leaders promised them the pillage of the city, and it was in vain. With Republican forces closing in, the rebels were forced to abandon their siege. Marching northwest towards Le Mans, victory looked increasingly impossible. Weeks prior, the royalist host numbered at least 60,000. Now its strength was halved, as disease, desertion, and bloodshed rapidly reduced their numbers. As the Republicans chased their prey from the walls of Angers, the scene was reminiscent of hell. Local peasants picked off the Vendean wounded, while Republican cavalry hunted down any stragglers. Historian Henri Chardon does not hide the misery. The army was in the most lamentable state, without ammunition, without bread, without hope. The moving descriptions of many do not allow us to provide any new documentation on its appalling misery. Illness, excessive cold, fatigue, discouragement claimed more victims than the Republican hunters. The bands died of cold on the roads. The peasants plucked them, says Gris, and then they had to be beaten to force them to bury them in their furrows. The road from Angers to Bourget was strewn with dead bodies. The air was stinking for a league around. One could smell a smell of corpses and rot that made one vomit. One could see, on the snow, women cut in two, children dead in their mothers' arms. It was a spectacle of horror. Marching northwest in an abysmal state, the end was near for the Vendeans. Claiming Le Mans on the 10th of December, the town would be the tomb of many. With Republican forces rapidly converging on Le Mans, the two sides locked horns on the 12th. Despite initial success for the rebels, thanks to General Vesterman's usual recklessness, the Blues got the upper hand. Confusion and panic soon engulfed the Whites. Initially, the Vendeans had heard rumours of victory, while exhaustion and fatigue promoted carelessness and drinking. Now, the Republicans were arriving in force. The result was not so much a battle, but a massacre. At first, it was panic which crushed these unfortunate souls. The Royalists had not adequately prepared for further setbacks, and only one road offered an escape from the Republic. As soldiers called for their wives, as mothers searched for their children, thousands swarmed a single narrow bridge. The result was carnage. Historian Theodore Murray retells the scene. In the city, through the darkness of a rainy evening, the most terrible rout began. The baggage cars parked under the arcades of the market halls were hurriedly harnessed. All the poor people, who had forgotten themselves in their houses, came out in terror, thinking only of fleeing. It was towards the Sarthe Bridge that the whole crowd rushed at once. The streets leading from the main square to the Éperon Square, and from the latter to the bridge, were filled with a terrible congestion. In this too narrow space, people crowded together, trampled each other, crushed each other against the walls of the houses. All the beings incapable of protecting themselves, lacking their natural supports, implored pity, asked at random for a friend, for support. Women, children, the sick fell toppled. Others, still pushed by the living flood, came in turn to fall on them, and swelled these piles of human bodies. Oxen and horses fell, and could not get up, and their efforts, The kicks they threw increased the number of victims. The unfortunate perished, crushed under the wheels of carriages trying to make their way. With the Republic's troops breaking into the suburbs of Le Mans, the end result was horrendous bloodshed. Rape, pillage and murder accompanied the triumphant blues. Firing squads eliminated those left behind, and when the dust finally settled, thousands of civilians were dead. Women, children and the elderly lay lifeless next to rebel soldiers. Intriguingly, these events remain topical today. It was only in 2009 that new mass graves were discovered containing hundreds of remains. In the episode extra for this episode, I'll be discussing this discovery and its place in the modern-day disputes arising from the Vendée's contentious history. We'll also unpack Republican accounts of the gruesome massacres. A bleak topic, I admit, but it is fascinating, so make sure not to miss it. Defeated at Le Mans in mid-December, the rebellion was all but crushed. Desperate to cross the Loire into the Vendée, a small contingent successfully did so in the days that followed. Most were less fortunate. The perilous crossing was soon halted by Republican gunboats, and the remnants of the once great host was now isolated and leaderless. Indeed, La Rochefoucauld was one of the lucky few to escape. The remaining Vendéans were pursued and destroyed within weeks. Some surrendered, others attempted to flee, but many were simply killed. The Battle of Savigny on the 23rd of December marked the end of major operations. In an infamous and contested quote, General Vesterman reported the rebellion's complete extermination. There is no more Vendée, Republican citizens. It died beneath our free sword, with its women and its children. I have just buried it in the swamps and the woods of Savigny. Following the orders that you gave to me, I crushed the children beneath the horses' hooves, massacred the women, who at least will bear no more brigands. I do not have a single prisoner to reproach myself with. I have exterminated them all. In mid-October 1793, the mighty Catholic and Royal Army had crossed the Loire River. Marching north to Granville, the host was at least 60,000 strong. Months later, the vast majority were dead. Soldiers and civilians perished en masse, while most survivors were taken prisoner. And yet, despite this march through utter hell, a darker chapter lay ahead. Paradoxically, the great battles were over, but the massacres were only just beginning. Thank you for listening to episode 96, Vendée, The March to Hell. In the next episode, we will unpack one of the most controversial debates of the entire revolutionary era. Don't miss episode 97, Vendée, Massacres or Genocide. Also not to be missed is the episode extra for this episode on the mass graves of Le Mans. It's a fascinating exploration of archaeology and history, and combined with a grim contemporary account of the massacres after the battle, there's plenty to unpack. This bonus content and so much more is waiting for you now in the Grey History community. So please, if you're enjoying the show, help produce history that isn't black and white, and sponsor Grey History for as little as a coffee or two a month. I could really use your support of the podcast, and I look forward to welcoming you personally at patreon.com. As always, thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Gilberto, Ron, Kevin S., and Fernando. Joining the amazing heroes are the fantastic champions of the people, Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Regis, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Susan, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, Sophia, Kevin, Scott, and Jersey.